50 million tourists visit Times Square every year, and a solid chunk of them leave wondering why they bothered. New Yorkers haven't gone near the place voluntarily since roughly 2003. Even the costumed characters are starting to annoy each other. So here's the question. Everyone in the city has been quietly asking for years why people are starting to hate Times Square. What Times Square actually is. Before getting into why so many people have soured on the place, it helps to remember what Times Square actually is. It's the bow-tie-shaped intersection where Broadway crosses 7th Avenue at 42nd Street in Midtown Manhattan, spanning roughly from 42nd to 47th Streets. That's it. 5 blocks of extraordinarily loud, extraordinarily lit, extraordinarily crowded real estate in one of the most expensive cities on Earth. Around 330,000 people pass through it on an average day. On its busiest days, that number climbs past 460,000. For context, that's more daily foot traffic than many mid-sized American cities have total residents, all flowing through a handful of blocks simultaneously. It's also, by most accounts, the most commercially surveilled pedestrian space in the world, with digital billboards the size of buildings cycling through advertisements at every angle. The Times Square Alliance, the business improvement district that oversees the area, maintains its own cleaning crews, police substation, and tourism office. Times Square essentially runs itself as a semi-autonomous commercial zone within the larger city, which is either impressive or alarming depending on how you feel about the whole enterprise. The numbers are staggering in almost any direction you look at them. Times Square generates an estimated $79 billion in annual economic activity for New York City. Broadway shows alone account for more than $1 billion in gross revenue in a typical season. The district employs hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly. Hotel occupancy rates in the immediate vicinity consistently outpace the city average. By every standard financial metric, Times Square is a wildly successful piece of urban real estate. What it is not, despite what the tourist brochures imply, is an authentic piece of New York City, as most New Yorkers actually experience or think about their city. That gap between what Times Square is marketed as and what it actually delivers on the ground is where most of the modern dissatisfaction lives. A brief history of what it used to be. Times Square didn't start out as the commercial spectacle it is today. The area was originally called Longacre Square, a carriage district in the 1800s, before the New York Times moved its headquarters there in 1904, and the city renamed the intersection in the paper's honor. The electric sign advertising began arriving in 1916, when the city council actively encouraged bright illuminated signage in the district, setting the visual template that has defined the area ever since. Through the first half of the 20th century, Times Square was genuinely glamorous. It was the center of the theater world, home to Broadway's original run of landmark productions, packed with first-run movie palaces, luxury hotels, and restaurants where you could see celebrities if you were lucky. The New Year's Eve ball drop started in 1907, and for decades, the celebration drew visitors who genuinely wanted to be there, rather than tourists checking off an item from a list. Then things changed, gradually, and then all at once. By the 1960s, zoning rules designed to limit the growth of disreputable businesses had largely failed, and the libertarian cultural shift of that decade had opened legal space for adult entertainment operations to multiply. The 25-cent peep show arrived in 1966, proved enormously profitable, and spawned dozens of imitators. Porn theaters, sex shops, and street prostitution followed. The mob moved into the area around 1968 and organized a significant portion of what was happening there. Drug dealing and violent crime escalated through the 1970s, and by the early 1980s, the area bounded by 40th and 50th Streets and 7th and 9th Avenues was recording over 15,000 crime complaints per year. Rolling Stone called 42nd Street the sleaziest block in America in 1981, which is quite an achievement for a street that runs the length of Manhattan. In 1984, despite sitting in the heart of one of the world's most valuable cities, the entire Times Square area was generating only $6 million in annual property taxes. The place was a fiscal and social catastrophe by any objective measure. The Giuliani cleanup and the Disney moment. The reversal began in the late 1980s and accelerated dramatically through the 1990s. Mayors Ed Koch and David Dinkins began redevelopment planning. Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who took office in 1994, escalated enforcement aggressively, launching what his administration called a quality of life crackdown that targeted the area's crime and adult entertainment industry. The NYPD shut down peep shows and pornographic theaters. New zoning laws prohibited adult businesses from operating within 500 feet of schools, churches, or each other, which effectively eliminated the concentration of the sex industry on 42nd Street by forcing establishments to close rather than comply. The symbolic turning point came when the Walt Disney Company signed a memorandum of understanding with the city on the last day of the Dinkins administration in 1993, agreeing to refurbish and reopen the historic New Amsterdam Theater on 42nd Street. The deal was finalized in 1995, including a $25 million low-interest government loan to Disney, which remains, depending on your perspective, either a smart public investment in urban revitalization or a remarkable amount of public money spent to bring a corporation already worth billions into a neighborhood it was going to profit handsomely from anyway. Disney's arrival sent a signal to the broader real estate and entertainment market that Times Square was safe for corporate investment, and the investment poured in. AMC, Madame Tussauds, hotel developers, office tower developers, all committed to the area within months of the Disney announcement. The old flickering neon and rundown marquees came down. Giant digital billboards went up. Chain restaurants opened on every corner. By the end of the decade, Times Square was scrubbed, brightly lit, and completely unrecognizable compared to what it had been 15 years earlier. The crime rate collapsed. The fiscal wreck of 1984 became the tax-generating machine it is today, drawing 50 million visitors annually. By any conventional urban policy metric, it was one of the most dramatic neighborhood turnarounds in American history. And then, somewhere in there, it became what a lot of people today can't stand: the costumed character problem. This is the one everyone knows about because, at some point in the past 20 years, it became impossible to walk through Times Square without getting cornered by a person in a Minnie Mouse suit aggressively requesting a tip. The costumed characters, Elmo, Spider-Man, Captain America, the Hulk, the Disney princesses, various Muppets, various bootleg versions of all of the above, arrived as a street economy during the 2000s and grew into a persistent source of complaints that eventually required legislative intervention. The first set of rules came in 2016, when the city passed a law restricting costumed performers to designated 8x50-foot activity zones within Times Square, after the Times Square Alliance documented that 65% of Times Square employees, residents, and regular visitors reported a negative experience with a costumed character within the prior 3 months. A separate survey found that 88% of documented interactions between costumed characters and members of the public involved the character touching someone without their consent, which is a number that would be alarming in almost any other context, and probably should be alarming in this one too. The 2016 rules helped marginally, but didn't solve the underlying problem, which was that some performers remained aggressive, regardless of where their designated zone was. Video documented characters corralling tourists, often with children, outside the activity zones before demanding tips, and the Times Square Alliance observed characters routinely violating the zones on busy weekends. One tourist told reporters after an incident, "I was in Times Square, and an avatar totally shook me down. They're standing in front of you with their hands out and don't stop until you give them what they deem is enough money." A second round of legislation passed in August 2021, creating a broader theater district zone between West 40th and West 50th Streets and from 6th Avenue to 8th Avenue, with new pedestrian flow zones marked in white stripes on the ground, intended to separate walking paths from solicitation areas. The fact that two separate legislative efforts over 5 years, complete with painted lines on the ground and defined activity zones, were required to address what is essentially a tip collection problem gives you some sense of the scale of disruption that had developed and the difficulty of solving it through regulation alone. Some of the performers comply, some don't. The NYPD issues summonses periodically. The cycle continues. The overcrowding nobody planned for. The pedestrian plaza transformation, which began as a trial in May 2009 when Mayor Michael Bloomberg closed Broadway to vehicle traffic between 42nd and 47th Streets, was by any traffic and environmental measure a success. Pedestrian injuries in the area dropped. Vehicle traffic on the surrounding streets actually improved rather than worsening, contrary to initial predictions. Air quality improved. Local businesses initially opposed it and then largely reversed their opposition once they saw the results. The original seating the city put out, inexpensive multicolored plastic lawn chairs, essentially patio furniture dropped into the middle of one of the world's most trafficked intersections, became an unlikely symbol of the experiment's low-budget ambition before being replaced with more permanent metal furniture in 2011. The problem is that removing cars from the equation invited an enormous increase in foot traffic on a street that was already dealing with hundreds of thousands of daily pedestrians, and nobody adequately planned for what that concentration of bodies would feel like at ground level. Urban planners call it pedlock, pedestrian gridlock, and Times Square developed a severe case of it that continues to define the experience of walking through on any busy afternoon or evening. 350,000 people passing through a few blocks in a day sounds like a statistic until you're standing in the middle of it, trying to move at anything faster than a reluctant shuffle, surrounded on all sides by people stopping to photograph the billboards, people being photographed by the billboards, people in costume demanding tips for having been photographed, people selling bootleg CDs, comedy club ticket hawkers, tour bus operators, and a dozen other categories of pedestrian that have claimed the plaza as their professional territory. The plaza design itself bears some responsibility. The pedestrian areas, while generous compared to the pre-2009 layout, don't scale well to the volume of simultaneous users they attract. The tables and chairs in the middle of the plaza create islands of stationary people that the moving crowd has to flow around, compressing the walkable space further. During New Year's Eve, when somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people pack into the square to watch the ball drop, a tradition that's been running since 1907, long before the pedestrian plaza existed, the density reaches levels that anyone with mild claustrophobia would find genuinely distressing. Joseph Rose, a longtime urban planning official who was involved in community board work during Times Square's various transformations, put it plainly: Times Square is at risk of becoming a place that New Yorkers avoid. That warning predates the plaza conversion. Since then, avoidance has become near total among residents who don't have a specific reason to be there. The corporate monoculture. The cleanup of the 1990s traded one set of problems for a different set that took longer to identify. Where Times Square once had an overabundance of seedy, small-scale, locally specific commerce, porn shops, yes, but also independent theaters, immigrant-owned shops, diners, working-class bars, it now has an overabundance of branded global chains that could be transplanted to any major city on Earth without changing their character in any meaningful way. The Olive Garden in Times Square is, for many New Yorkers, the single most useful symbol of what went wrong. Not because there's anything particularly terrible about the Olive Garden, but because its presence at the most famous intersection in one of the world's most culinarily rich cities says something about who Times Square is actually designed to serve. The answer is tourists who want something familiar, something they recognize from home, something that won't surprise them, which is a perfectly legitimate consumer preference. It just doesn't have much to do with New York. The same pattern holds for nearly every retail and dining option in the square. Hard Rock Cafe, Dave & Buster's, Applebee's, Guy Fieri's American Kitchen, Bubba Gump Shrimp Company. The brands rotate slightly over the years, but the category remains constant. High volume, high margin, brand familiar tourist dining that no local would choose when every other neighborhood in the city offers something more interesting at comparable or lower prices. This homogenization isn't an accident. The real estate economics of Times Square, where commercial rents have climbed to among the highest on Earth, essentially price out any tenant that can't generate extremely high revenue per square foot. That restricts the viable business category to nationally scaled chains with the capitalization to sustain Manhattan rents, leaving no room for the kind of independent, locally specific businesses that give neighborhoods their character. The cleaning up of Times Square and the subsequent surge in tourism created a rent environment that makes it functionally impossible for a small business to survive there, which is a specific type of success that contains its own known failure. The digital billboard situation is a separate but related phenomenon. Times Square is legally required to be illuminated. Buildings in the special Times Square sign district must maintain a minimum level of illumination as a condition of certain zoning allowances, which creates a feedback loop where more and brighter advertising is not just tolerated, but structurally encouraged. Some of the largest individual advertising installations in Times Square measure in the thousands of square feet and run content 24 hours a day. The result is an environment where marketing operates at a scale and intensity that most people don't voluntarily choose to spend extended time in. The constant motion and noise and light that makes for a compelling photograph becomes exhausting to actually inhabit for more than 20 minutes. Architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable described the Times Square redevelopment approach in the New York Times as having all the elements of a Joe Orton black comedy, a multi-billion-dollar real estate deal that packaged public morality and profitable mathematics together under the banner of cleanup. The observation was made in 1989, before the full scale of what the place would become was visible, but the tension she identified between the civic aspirations of the redevelopment and the commercial reality it produced has only become clearer with time. The scam economy. Beyond the costumed characters, Times Square has developed a robust informal scam economy that operates at the margins of legality and exploits the specific vulnerability of people who are new to a city and haven't yet learned which offers to refuse. CD sellers, a persistent Times Square institution that has been running in some form for decades, work by pressing unwanted CDs into the hands of passers-by, then demanding payment for the album now that you've accepted it. The 2021 vendor legislation specifically included CD sellers in its activity zone restrictions precisely because of this tactic, grouping them with costumed characters as sources of documented unwanted solicitation. The sellers generally position themselves near the high-traffic corners where pedestrian flow creates the most opportunity for contact. Fake Buddhist monks, sometimes wearing orange robes and carrying incense, approach tourists to press gifts, a bracelet, a bead, a small trinket, into their hands and then solicit donations with varying degrees of insistence. The practice is not limited to Times Square, but concentrates there due to the volume of unfamiliar visitors. The monks are widely understood by New Yorkers to be a scam operation, but to a tourist from Ohio experiencing Midtown Manhattan for the first time, the transaction is ambiguous enough to produce compliance. Comedy club ticket vendors, who are technically a legitimate category of business promoting real shows in real venues, have a documented history of misrepresenting the lineups of the venues they're selling tickets for, telling tourists that famous comedians will be performing when the actual lineup is whatever open mic acts happen to be booked that evening. The gap between what's promised on the sidewalk and what's delivered in the club has been a recurring subject of local journalism and consumer complaint for years. Restaurants in and immediately around the square have been documented charging prices significantly above what comparable meals cost elsewhere in the city, sometimes without making those prices sufficiently visible before the meal, knowing that tourists on their first and only visit to New York have limited comparison shopping to do and limited recourse if the bill doesn't match their expectations. A meal in Times Square that costs $80 per person would cost $50 or less in almost any other Manhattan neighborhood of comparable quality, with the premium being essentially a location tax imposed on people who don't know there's an alternative. Times Square has its own specific tax on inexperience, and it collects that tax reliably from the 50 million visitors passing through every year who don't know where else to go. The scam economy exists because the target population, tourists on vacation, often with children, often carrying visible cameras or maps, is ideal, large enough to sustain a significant number of operators, transient enough that repeat victimization rarely occurs, and trusting enough of an unfamiliar environment that the initial trust extended to a street interaction is higher than it would be from a local who knows better. What New Yorkers actually think. The divide between what Times Square means to tourists and what it means to people who live in the city around it is absolute in a way that's almost difficult to overstate. For a visitor from another country or another part of the United States, Times Square is New York. The distilled version, the famous one, the one that appears in every movie set in the city and in every piece of promotional material the tourism board has ever produced. Standing in the middle of it, surrounded by the scale and intensity of the lights and crowds, genuinely produces an experience that photographs can almost communicate. For New Yorkers, it's a place you walk through as quickly as possible if your commute forces you near it, a place you avoid entirely if it doesn't, and a place you take visiting family members with the resigned acceptance of someone performing a necessary civic duty. The cultural attitude of New Yorkers toward Times Square has a long and well-documented history of eye-rolling at people who actually enjoy it, which is its own particular form of snobbery, but it also reflects something real about the disconnect between the space and the city surrounding it. The practical experience of being a New Yorker navigating Times Square during peak tourist hours, roughly noon to midnight on any day between May and January, involves the specific frustration of trying to move with purpose through a crowd that has no particular destination and no particular urgency about reaching it. Tourists stop in the middle of sidewalks to take photographs. They walk four abreast in groups that span the entire pedestrian path. They gather in stationary clusters around street performers or novelty storefronts, blocking natural pedestrian flow the way a fallen tree blocks a river. For someone trying to get from one place to another, this is the kind of experience that produces the particular jaw-clenching tension that longtime residents of the area describe with a precision born of repetition. A common refrain from longtime New Yorkers is that the most famous version of the city is also the least representative of it, that anyone who wants to understand what New York actually is should travel approximately 6 blocks in any direction from Times Square and encounter the neighborhoods, restaurants, and street life that make the city what it is to the people who live there. Times Square, in this reading, is a performance of a city rather than the city itself, a stage set designed to communicate New York to people who don't know New York, stripped of the specific and the idiosyncratic in favor of the recognizable and the scalable. Is it getting any better? The honest answer is, not particularly, though the worst of the post-pandemic period has stabilized somewhat. Times Square went through its own COVID-related collapse in 2020, with pedestrian traffic dropping to almost nothing during the extended closure of Broadway and the broader disruption to international and domestic tourism. The scenes of an empty Times Square during lockdown, which were photographed and shared extensively, with a mixture of awe and unease, were genuinely striking precisely because the place had become so identified with constant, overwhelming crowding that its emptiness felt like something out of a disaster film. When visitors returned, so did all the familiar complaints, roughly at their pre-pandemic intensity. The costumed characters reappeared, the CD sellers came back, the chain restaurants refilled, the pedestrian density climbed back toward its previous highs. The Times Square Alliance continued its ongoing effort to manage vendor behavior with new rules and enforcement mechanisms, with mixed results. The ongoing challenge is that the plaza format created in 2009 has hardened into a permanent fixture. The costumed character economy has proven resilient to multiple rounds of regulation, and the corporate monoculture of chain restaurants and tourist retail has deepened rather than diversified as rents in the area have climbed. None of the structural forces driving the dissatisfaction have changed direction. If anything, the combination of continued overcrowding, persistent street harassment, and an experience that feels increasingly disconnected from anything authentically urban has intensified the gap between Times Square's reputation and its reality. There's an argument that Times Square is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, generating enormous amounts of tourism revenue for a city that depends heavily on it, providing employment for a significant number of people at various levels of the hospitality and entertainment industries, and delivering an experience that 50 million visitors a year apparently find worth repeating. That argument is correct, as far as it goes. The question is whether the version of Times Square that accomplishes all of that is a public space that serves the city and its residents, or whether it's a commercial zone that happens to be located inside a city and uses the city's name and reputation as its primary marketing asset while returning relatively little of that value to the people who live there. The billboards keep cycling, the tourists keep arriving, the person in the Elmo suit is still out there somewhere, just within the designated activity zone, and New Yorkers keep walking around it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.